Frost feathered the wire like breath made visible, and the tower lamp threw a tired cone across the snow as the M1937 field range ticked itself awake. The mess sergeant laid the first rashers down. The fat met steel with a sharp report, a sound like distant small arms, followed by the slow hum of a kitchen coming to temperature. The smell lifted, salt, smoke, a sweetness from the bakery, and drifted over the compound where the new arrivals stood in wool coats too large, tags still crisp. Lieutenant Joe Ramirez checked his watch, checked the post log, then checked the line again, a ritual of custody and conscience. He wore the M1 Garand easily, 8 rounds asleep in its on block, and he knew the night had been colder than the thermometer admitted because the tower dog's breath hung like a pennant. Hana Takahashi cupped her hands to her mouth and did not understand that this scent, this domestic thunder, belonged to her now, by treaty, and by the stubborn will of a country that wrote rules and kept them. She had learned to inventory pain with a nurse's calm and to triage hopeless cases on a cliff where wind tore the pleas away. She had not learned a word for this smell. Ruth Kaplan approached with a clipboard and a smile that was procedure first and kindness as a close second. Article 11, she would say. Equal in quantity and quality to depot troops. Not charity, policy. Behind her, a bakery window cracked just enough to let out a ribbon of heat. Someone inside laughed, then the laugh cut to work and the bread came out on time. Ramirez mapped the perimeter with his boot soles, reading the compound the way a baker reads a rising loaf. 2 guards per gate, towers staffed, lines painted on snow where lines mattered. The mess crew moved like a drill team, fuel checked, burners primed, steam table hissing. The M1937 would flare unless the gasket seated true. Connolly, the sergeant, tapped it with a screwdriver and nodded when the flame turned from yellow to blue. Everything here had a sound. The range sighed. The truck coughed. The wire sang a little when the wind touched it. Bacon snapped and Hannah flinched, not from fear, not anymore, but from recognition that something was changing inside her, a small surrender to the fact of abundance. "Ma'am," Ramirez said to Ruth and to the rules she embodied, "line opens at 06:30. He wanted the first tray to slide when the clock agreed. He wanted the policy to be as real as the smell. The wind climbed the fence, carrying salt and smoke like a promise. Across the yard, Hana lowered her hands and breathed in, as if testing a world that had decided not to hate her. The whistle blew, thin and official, and the line began to form. Sergeant Oates O'Hara eased the GMC CCKW down the ramp, double-clutched, and let the inline 6 settle into a low, contented thrum. Canvas flaps snapped like flags. Frost rhymed the radiator cap and traced feathery veins along the hood where numbers stenciled in white had outlived 2 winters. He backed to the mess dock until the bed kissed the bumper stop, set the brake, and hopped down in a puff of steam and habit. The tailgate dropped to reveal a quartermaster's psalm. Sacks of flour tight as drums, tins of lard with their own metallic perfume, crates of bacon wrapped in paper that had learned the language of Greece. The journey of a single slice had crossed states and systems, farm to packing plant, plant to depot, depot to railhead, railhead to motor pool, and at last to this dock, where steam haloed everything like a benediction. O'Hara chalked a checkmark because chalk made things true. "The long table's set," he said, affectionate, as if blessing the load. Ramirez took weights and counts, pencil steady even with gloves. Ruth Kaplan read the menu like a contract and nodded at the line that mattered, equal in quantity and quality to depot troops. "We feed them like our own," she told Connolly, who pretended he didn't need the reminder and secretly liked being part of a principle. The M1937 field range drank gasoline through its jets and returned BTUS like a mortgage paid on time. Connolly tuned the flame until it settled into a blue that meant reliability under snow. The bakery crew, sleeves rolled, wrists flour pale, moved dozens at a time from rack to cooling table. Bread like cake, a German had once said. The phrase stuck to the walls, a compliment and a piece of evidence. O'Hara added a note about chains on the rear wheels, about a slipping crown gear he'd feel before any mechanic would. Trucks were creatures. You learned their moods. Ruth explained, not for the first time, that breakfast was a weapon in the ledger sense, an entry on the side labelled civilization. You could not fake a tray line that started exactly at 0630 any more than you could fake a convoy arriving in whiteout. The system either held or it didn't. Ramirez's ledger caught the holding. Gallons of coffee issued, pounds of bacon consumed, head count by compound, guard strength by hour. He put numbers to the smell so that later, when someone questioned what had been promised, he could open the notebook and point. The dock crew cleared the last crate, and O'Hara slammed the gate up with a thud that echoed against the bakery's bricks. The engine note changed. Ready to go, not eager, just certain. Snow crystals swirled as he pulled away. Behind him, the first pans met the hot steel and sang. Ahead, a railhead slept under drifts, waiting for another carload to wake it. On Saipan, the wind had a knife in it, and the cliffs took everything that wasn't tied down, including, too often, hope. Hana remembered the way the megaphone voice fractured on the rock, English first, then Japanese pleading for surrender as if words could build a bridge over the void. In the field hospital, they stretched rice with roots and boiled it in a pot darkened by so many fires it no longer shone. Radios failed because batteries did. Plasma arrived when chance allowed, and never when it was needed most. She held men who had memorized a catechism of no surrender, and learned that catechisms don't heal. The day she was taken, the cataloguing felt like a dream. Name, age, unit, profession, a tag on a string, a glance that weighed her and found a human being instead of a problem to be solved by gravity. The arithmetic of that island remains a wound and a lesson. Roughly 31,000 in the garrison, and by August perhaps 1,800 Japanese prisoners, numbers that tell a story of cliffs more eloquently than adjectives can. American casualties near 16,500, more than 3,000 of those dead, the rest stitched, splintered, shipped. Guam's ledger wrote in similar ink, thousands of Japanese dead to scarcely more than 1,000 prisoners, a ratio that would have looked impossible on any staff table drawn before the war, and yet became the common math of an empire's unravelling. Hana carried those numbers in her bones like healed fractures. You forget them until weather changes, then they ache again. When the smell reached her in Wisconsin, it brought those ledgers with it. If a nation fed its prisoners bacon, eggs, coffee and bread that tasted suspiciously like cake, what on earth did it feed its Marines on an island ridge? The question moved through her like a hand over a page, slowing on each line. A single stateside bakery could turn out thousands of loaves in a morning. A single motor pool could put hundreds of trucks into motion with nothing more dramatic than a grease pencil and a schedule. She would not have known the model number, CCKW, but she would have recognized certainty when she saw it rumbling under canvas. The implausible statistic hid in plain sight. In the Pacific campaigns, Japanese dead could outnumber prisoners 10, 20 to 1. Back in America, the breadline rose 3 times a day without fail. Back on Saipan, the sea kept returning what it took. In Wisconsin, the kitchen kept returning breakfast like a tide that obeyed a whistle. The first tray slid, and Hana had the scandalous thought that surrenders might begin not with leaflets or loud hailers, but with a smell you could not argue with. Ruth Kaplan set the clipboard down beside the stainless tray, and the line on the page shone like a vein under skin. Rations equal in quantity and quality to those of depot troops. She spoke the clause out loud, not to sermonize, but because words become sturdier when you make them stand. Connolly answered with a grunt that meant he'd heard it before, and a quick glance at the steam table that meant he respected it anyway. Regulations were not romance. They were the steel skeleton under every kind impulse, the shape that held when the wind leaned on the walls. She moved through the stations with the calm of a nurse and the suspicion of an auditor. Ounces of protein per person checked. Caloric targets for cold weather days that could peel heat off a body faster than courage checked. Coffee urns burnished and full checked. The M1937 field range whispered its blue flame whisper. She touched the housing near the manifold and felt the good heat soak that meant not a degree wasted. Behind her, the bakery crew tipped loaves and wrapped the bottoms, listening for the hollow cathedral knock that told them a crumb had set. Ramirez shadowed her with a ledger. He didn't need to, but he trusted numbers the way a pilot trusts instruments when cloud eats the horizon. In the infirmary kitchen, Hannah held a mug whose warmth climbed her wrists and nested in places cold had taken residence. Ruth explained the word breakfast as if literature, offering examples and synonyms, mapping it to the idea of a day that begins with something given rather than something taken. She translated Geneva, Article 11, the Catechism of Mercy that insisted the United States feed enemies as it fed its own, and watched comprehension slide across Hannah's face, not joy, not yet, but a dignified relief. Facts have a feel. Technical details threaded the scene without slowing it. Ruth noted that the POW ration mirrored depot troops, that garrison breakfasts typically included pork, eggs, starch and coffee, adjusted for religious or medical need. She recorded storage temperatures and spoilage rates, scribbled a note about a gasket Connolly planned to replace before the weekend. The mess line thrummed, processing bodies like an assembly line puts shape to steel, and she thought briefly of factories stamping fenders and wondered if there was a part number for kindness. Outside, O'Hara's truck coughed awake and pulled toward the railhead to meet the next car, a small node in a web that crossed a continent without tangling. Ruth signed the inspection with a practiced hand. The pen's scratch sounded louder than it should have, like a verdict. "Satisfactory," she said, and the stamp came down. The line moved. The day, by policy and by will, had begun. Ramirez opened his pocket notebook and the columns stood at attention. Loaves, gallons, pounds, head count. He had learned the habit from his parents' bakery in San Antonio, where every ounce of flour not accounted for wrote its absence in the crust, and he had carried it into uniform the way a man carries a prayer. He didn't think of himself as a mathematician. He thought of himself as someone who distrusts memory and trusts graphite. Beside him, O'Hara talked convoy like a man telling a fishing story without embellishment. Turnaround times, fuel stops, snow chains, a crown gear that sang at 30 and sulked at 35. Trucks had temperaments. So did kitchens. Numbers translated both. They moved the ledger and the schedule back and forth until the page became a map. Bakery throughput in the hundreds of loaves per shift, multiplied by 3 times 7 days, equaled a kind of quiet artillery that landed not with crump and flash, but with warmth in a tin tray. Coffee by the gallon measured in morale, bacon by the pound, an argument written in fat and protein that even an enemy could not debate. Ruth picked a figure here, a regulation there, and tied them to wrists and faces, flushed cheeks at the line, steadier hands in the infirmary, an interpreter's pencil that no longer trembled from cold. He added guard-to-prisoner ratios and tower relief schedules, the sort of figures that never make commemorative plaques but keep men from making mistakes they can't take back. O'Hara noted average speed, 45 miles per hour in good weather, less with chains, and fuel burn that mattered when the thermometer tried to turn gasoline into jelly. They made a triangle of competence: kitchen, motor pool, perimeter. If any side sagged, the whole shape leaned. If all held, breakfast became inevitable, and inevitability was a kind of power. They did not brag. They compared. A single day's issuance against the weekly ration a Japanese regiment might hope for under strain. A single motor pool's rollout against the ad hoc mule trains feeding island garrisons. Where they lacked exact numbers, they said likely, would have typical, because truth thrives in careful language. The goal was not to invent superiority, but to measure it where it already stood, humming in plain sight. Ramirez wrote one line low on the page: "We can fight you and feed you both, forever." He underlined forever once, then felt foolish and drew a box around the day's date instead. The whistle for the noon shift floated in. O'Hara flipped his glove off, licked a thumb, and turned the page for tomorrow. The ledger waited, patient as winter. Hannah warmed her hands above the stove and listened to Bacon talk in a language she was learning. Pop for the first meeting of fat and metal, hiss for the long conversation of heat. The scent climbed the back of her throat in a way that did not ask permission. She counted what she could see, the way nurses count pulse: eggs stacked in trays, tins of lard lined like soldiers, bread in formation on cooling racks, coffee kept hot with the discipline of a sentry walking his post. The word breakfast had broken the seal on more than a meal. It named a world where a day began with provision rather than apology. Ruth explained gently how bacon grease back home was saved in coffee tins and turned into glycerin for propellants, a domestic alchemy that folded kitchens into ordnance lines. Waste to weapon, generosity to logistics. Hannah thought of Saipan's field hospital, where bandages were boiled and reused, where plasma came when miracles did. She breathed the certainty here and let it displace an older catechism. Bushido had not prepared her for a system that enforced mercy with checklists and made punctuality into a creed. She did not know model numbers and did not need to, but the trucks declared themselves anyway. Over 500,000 CCKW 2.5-ton 6x6 trucks had been built. That fleet would have exceeded by a vast margin the total vehicles available to many Japanese formations at the war's outset. The statistic felt impossible until she set it beside a tray line that never missed its whistle. Scale hides in plain sight. It's the way a door opens on time every time, the way the generator coughs once and then hums as if humming were a verb invented by America. She amended the impossible with a nurse's qualifier, likely typical, not to flinch from truth, but to respect it. The interpreter waited with a pencil, not demanding, simply present. She spoke small things first, non-operational habits about code names for depots, nicknames for medics, the way boats were loaded when they were loaded at all. Nothing treacherous, everything accurate. The stove clicked as it cooled, and the warmth stayed in her palms like proof. If a nation could feed its enemies like this, then its friends were not running on promises. Outside, O'Hara's truck idled and the exhaust drew white loops that vanished as the wind made a decision. Ramirez walked the line in that unhurried way that says both authority and regard. The pan hissed, the smell rose, and Hannah, who had learned to measure a day by what it took from her, let herself measure this one by what it gave. Sleet came on first, a soft bullet that flattened against the hood, and then the snow arrived in earnest, turning the motor pool into a white geometry of silhouettes and exhaust. Sergeant Oates O'Hara walked the line with a gloved hand on each truck's fender, listening to the inline six idle like a patient animal. He had chained the rear wheels before midnight and bagged the radiators against the wind, a trick learned from a Nebraska winter that had no interest in the war. The railhead was socked in, cars stalled by drifts that looked permanent until a shovel taught them manners. The camp could have called a delay, and no one would have argued, but punctuality here was a creed, and creeds don't melt. O'Hara kept the engines on a slow rotation, 15 minutes at fast idle, 5 at a whisper, to spare gasoline without letting frost claim the block. He checked oil that had thickened toward treacle, rolled extension cords to crankcase heaters, tapped a fuel filter with a knuckle until it stopped sulking. Trucks have moods. Winter teaches you to bargain. In the bakery, flour hung like a ghost in the lamps, and the crew kept to their cadence with the piety of men who know the whistle never learns to forgive. Racks rotated in and out with a choreography that remembered other storms. Loaves knocked hollow and steamed in the cold like breath on a mirror. In the mess hall, the M1937 field range whispered blue and steady at first, a good sign in weather that turned fuel surly. Connolly moved station to station, palm held close enough to feel heat without earning a burn, and wrote a parts list he hoped he wouldn't need. Jets, a gasket for burner 2, a spare regulator. Ramirez's tower log marched by tens. Guard reliefs shortened to keep fingers. Boots swapped to rescue toes from becoming rumours. He walked the wire and counted the small lights that meant certainty, generator, bakery, mess. In the compound, prisoners huddled by nationality and habit, and the smell of bacon still managed to find them through snow, as certain as the idea that morning is an argument you must make anew. It would have been easy to say Article 11 could wait for sunlight. Instead, the camp chose to keep faith with a sentence written long before this storm. Bacon hissed. Coffee boiled. Flour turned to bread because men turned racks. The CCKWS idled like a choir hitting its note. At 0400 a new sound arrived, thin and sickly. Connolly bent, frowned, and rapped the housing with the heel of his hand. The flame guttered yellow, then coughed out, leaving a darkness too small to notice and too large to ignore. Somewhere in a tin of spares lay the gasket that could translate gasoline into breakfast. Outside, the wind kept saying no. Inside, 3 men and a rule prepared to say yes on time anyway. Ruth's breath made little flags as she jogged across the yard with a square tin tucked under her arm, the kind of container that had once held cookies and now held certainty. Connolly had the apron off and the burner shroud open, screws nested in a spoon so they wouldn't wander. "Gasket," he said without ceremony. 2-inch. Ruth tipped the tin and let labelled envelopes slide like playing cards until the right size flashed up. She knelt beside the range and passed tools the way a scrub nurse passes clamps, without wasted motion, without asking, with the mutual belief that precision is a moral act. The old gasket came off reluctant and brittle, a winter story told in cork and failure. Connolly cleaned the seat with a strip of emery, wiped it with a rag that had learned every smell a kitchen can make, and set the new circle home. O'Hara stood in the doorway, shaking snow from his cap, carrying news in the set of his shoulders. The trucks would hold, the rail would clear by noon, he could buy them time. Ramirez checked his watch and said nothing, because nothing needed saying except the hour. Procedure can be love when love must be measured. Connolly cracked the valve and the range exhaled, a low, attentive blue that meant business. He watched for a minute because pride is the enemy of verification, then nodded once. Pans went back where pans belong. Bacon returned to the flat top and began its familiar immigrant song. The coffee urn hiccuped and settled into its steady simmer. Steam rose from the sinks like prayer. Ruth moved down the line, checking temperatures, portion weights, the small numerals that keep promises from becoming slogans. She marked down a note about fuel consumption in cold snaps and asked for a second gasket to be ordered before the weekend. Connolly grunted assent. In another building, the bakery crew banged racks into place and someone laughed because laughter is a tool too. On the perimeter, Ramirez intercepted a quarrel before it had edges, speaking softly and using the weather as his ally. He sent one prisoner to the infirmary to thaw hands that had gone from red to white and back to red, then posted a reminder at the gate about line order. He did not raise his voice. The tower dog barked once and then decided against it. When the whistle went, it sounded thin and tinny under snow, but it sounded on time. The first tray slid, and the bread's crust cracked at the corner where steam wanted a way out. Hannah stood with her mug and watched the line move with the indifferent grace of a machine that had learned compassion. Ruth signed the morning inspection before the ink could think twice, and the stamp came down with the weight of a small gavel. Breakfast, by order of law and labour, commenced. The interview room smelled faintly of starch and hot metal, the odour a stove leaves behind when the flame is killed, but the iron remembers. The interpreter sharpened his pencil with a penknife and waited as if waiting were part of the questioning. Hana sipped from a mug she had come to trust and began with small, harmless truths. The nicknames medics used for plasma tins, the way a depot clerk on Saipan tied tags with a sailor's knot, the habit of loading barges at dusk when there was anything to load. None of it would win a battle. All of it could help a planner place weight where weight mattered. Ramirez kept his ledger closed, letting quiet behave like a pressure that had nothing to do with force. Ruth listened for the moment when fear burned off and habit spoke. It arrived not as confession, but as correction. "Not that call sign," Hana said gently, and gave another, no longer current, but accurate enough to confirm a pattern. The pencil moved. So did the day. Word of breakfast spread the way weather does. Leaflets had been tossed into wind on many islands promising humane treatment, hot food, a doctor's eye. Those promises meant more when someone inside the wire could swear they had found coffee at the end of them. You cannot audit a rumour, but you can measure its consequences. Somewhere on another island, a small knot of men would hear that an American camp served a meal like depot troops and decide the Empire's math had changed. Ruth explained the fat salvage collections back home, how bacon grease rendered in kitchens became glycerin that became propulsion. Hana thought of it as a closed loop of certainty. Breakfast begetting the power to make more breakfasts, mercy fueling the means to continue mercy. She could not see the factories, but the numbers walked into the room anyway. At a plant called Willow Run, she was told, American workers had reached a tempo that would have seemed a fable at the war's start. By 1944, roughly one B-24 heavy bomber rolling out about every hour at peak, sheet metal and rivets taught to behave like abundance, and on roads from Wisconsin to the coasts, a fleet of more than 500,000 CCKW 2.5-ton trucks kept time like a metronome. Against that rhythm, scarcity loses its argument. The interpreter capped his pencil when they were done. Nothing sensational had been said. Everything had mattered. Ramirez reopened his ledger and wrote 2 lines that were not numbers. Keep faith, keep time. In the compound, men who had once vowed never to yield watched a tray line move with mechanical grace and discovered that the will to die is a brittle instrument when placed beside a system that refuses to break. Outside, the snow eased. Far off, a train announced itself with a long, confident horn that sounded like a promise being kept. 2 notebooks lay on the desk like maps, Ramirez's grease-smudged ledger beside Ruth's clean inspection forms. Between them, a wall chart of the Central Pacific pinned islands into a geometry that only time and tonnage could explain. They did not plan campaigns. They translated breakfasts into outcomes. Ramirez ran a finger down columns that looked ordinary until you read them as doctrine. Loaves per shift, multiplied by shifts per day, by days per week, by mouths per compound, predictable abundance converting chaos into a schedule. Ruth cross-checked weights and temperatures and penciled a remark about fuel use during prolonged cold snaps. Individually, their notes were housekeeping. Together, they were a theory of victory. Numbers were not the whole war, but the war without numbers is a prayer without breath. More than 500,000 CCKW 2.5-ton trucks on American roads moved food, ammunition, men, and meaning. Meatpacking plants ran as if the calendar had been shortened, turning hogs and cattle into pork and beef that travelled by rail car and convoy to wherever a mess sergeant stood a ladle's length from law. Stateside bakeries produced thousands of loaves in the time it took a snow squall to blow through. The ledger became a drumbeat to which mess, bakery and motorpool kept time. They set those entries against the ratios that haunted the islands. Saipan's arithmetic, roughly 31,000 in the garrison, about 1,800 Japanese prisoners by August, American losses in the tens of thousands, argued that ideology had met material and found itself outnumbered by physics. Guam's figure, thousands of enemy dead to roughly 1,200 prisoners, pushed the point harder. When a nation can sustain that level of expenditure at the front while maintaining garrison standard rations for captives at home, it is not merely winning, it is outlasting. Ruth traced a pencil line from Wisconsin to a West Coast port, from port to a blue arrow aimed at Okinawa. "Same engine," she said. "Bigger hill." O'Hara ducked in long enough to drop a dispatch. Rail moving again, trucks to rotate at noon, road crews chewing a path through drifts with the optimism of men who own shovels. Connolly walked past carrying a box of spares, insurance against the gasket that would try to die at 4 in the morning. The map became less a picture and more a promise. Bakery throughput meant fewer fights in mess lines, which meant calmer compounds, which meant cleaner interviews, which meant better intelligence, which meant fewer surprises at the next beachhead. This was not romance. It was causality. Ramirez closed his ledger on the day's totals and felt the satisfaction of a soldier who fights with punctuality. Ruth capped her pen with the click that tells the room an argument has been won. Outside, a truck downshifted, and the smell of yeast met bacon in the doorway like two halves of the same proof. Hannah sat on a bunk near the stove and reread a leaflet not as warning or threat, but as a document that had found its witness. The promises, humane treatment, rations equal to depot troops, medical care, were no longer abstractions. They had the weight of coffee, the logic of bread, the reliability of a whistle that sounded on schedule in a snowstorm. She closed her eyes and listened as if the convoy itself were an instrument. Somewhere a truck shifted, a generator coughed, a range exhaled. The music of abundance had learned all the parts. She considered the catechism that had tutored her to despise surrender. There had been courage in it and honour of a kind, but it had not accounted for systems that enforce mercy as policy. Bushido had prepared her to die well. Geneva had prepared her to live and tell the truth. Ruth explained again how grease saved in kitchen tins back home became glycerin, how that became propulsion that in turn kept trucks moving, bakeries lit, water hot. A closed loop of certainty, she called it, breakfast funding the means to make tomorrow's breakfast. In another world, the idea would have sounded like clever poetry. Here it sounded like inventory. Hannah thought of the beachheads still to come and imagined field kitchens igniting on schedule while artillery registered and engineers laid matting for airstrips. She pictured the quiet tyranny of checklists defeating the noisy tyranny of slogans. She did not know numbers for aircraft and ships and shells, and she did not need them. She had seen the ratio that mattered, how many times a day an enemy nation could keep a promise under a sky that did not care. The leaflet rustled in her hands and felt like a ration card stamped with the word tomorrow. She pressed it into her pocket. When Ramirez passed on rounds, she nodded to him with the small ceremonial bow she would not surrender. He touched the bill of his cap with a courtesy that belonged to no country and every good one. The stove clicked as it cooled, and the warmth stayed in her palms like proof. The old catechism did not shatter. It eroded, becoming a beach where a new tide could lay its weight. Outside, chains ticked against fenders, and the long table rolled on. Spring took the wire from white to muddy and opened the bakery windows until the smell of yeast wandered the yard like a veteran on a familiar street. The tower dog swapped frost-rimmed whiskers for a tongue that lolled in lazy approval. Breakfast still formed up at the whistle, and the mess line still moved with the indifferent grace of a well-trained machine. Camp McCoy did not announce a lesson. It lived one. The doctrine that had fed enemies as well as depot troops wrote itself into muscle memory. Check the gasket, hold the line, keep time. Ramirez copied his ledgers into a cleaner hand and found that months of small totals had composed a statement on strategy. Mercy made interviews steadier, steadiness made intelligence cleaner, cleanliness made operations quieter, and quiet saved lives you never meet. Ruth sent her final inspection summaries up the chain with the confidence of a rule that had proven itself under ice and doubt. The fat salvage posters came down. Their tins had already gone to glycerin and smoke. O'Hara bled the lines, changed the oil, and taught a new driver the personality of a CCKW, how it liked to be downshifted on the slope, and how it hated a lazy hand on the choke. Connolly inventoried spares and left 2 gaskets in the tin because the universe respects a man who plans for 4 in the morning. Hannah wrote a statement not of betrayal, but of accuracy, a nurse's record of what she had witnessed and what she now believed about systems that keep faith. She would carry the smell of bacon into a piece that had not yet learned its own vocabulary. The impossible remained visible if you knew where to look. A nation that had built more than 500,000 deuce-and-a-halfs to haul food and shells. Shipyards that could launch cargo vessels in days when schedule demanded days. Assembly lines that taught metal to meet the hour hand. None of it contradicted the blood price paid in coral and jungle. It explained how that price bought victory instead of stalemate. When the thaw finished and the mud cured into dust, the camp's rhythm stayed the same, because right habits do not check with the weather before they report for duty. One morning, Hannah paused just beyond the mess door and breathed in. Salt, smoke, a hint of sweetness from the bakery. The war's theorem reduced to a cent. In a nation where breakfast arrives exactly on time, tyranny cannot. She stepped into the line, carrying the proof into whatever came next.